every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The salt-laced wind that whips off Dorchester Bay and funnels through the narrow streets of South Boston carries with it more than just the chill of the Atlantic. It carries whispers. For generations, this was a place of secrets, a tight-knit, predominantly Irish-American enclave where parish boundaries were more important than city maps, and the code of silence, the infamous omerta of the American Mafia, found its Celtic equivalent. It was a world unto itself, suspicious of outsiders and fiercely protective of its own. It was in this crucible of loyalty and insularity that a monster was forged, a man who would one day be seen by some as a neighborhood protector, a local boy made good, and by others, more accurately, as a soulless predator. His name was James Bulger, but the world would come to know him by a nickname he despised, Whitey. The story of Whitey Bulger is not merely the chronicle of a brutal gangster. His reign of terror, lasting for more than 2 decades, was not a simple product of criminal cunning or ruthless violence, though he possessed both in terrifying abundance. The true dark heart of his story lies in a paradox that seems almost impossible to comprehend. For the majority of his criminal career, James Whitey Bulger, one of the most prolific and sadistic murderers in modern American history, was a protected asset of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He wasn't just eluding the law, he was enabled by it. He was a top echelon informant, a designation that gave him a license to kill, to extort, to traffic, all under the watchful, complicit eye of the very men sworn to bring him down. His story is a chilling case study in how the lines between good and evil can blur, then corrode, and finally collapse entirely. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of corruption. We will explore the malignant symbiosis that formed between a calculating sociopath and a federal agency so obsessed with one enemy, the Italian Mafia, that it was willing to make a deal with the devil himself. We will trace the rot that began with one ambitious agent from South Boston and spread through the hallowed halls of the J. Edgar Hoover Building. This is the story of how a gangster corrupted the law, and how, in turn, the law betrayed the people it was meant to protect, leaving a trail of bodies and shattered faith in its wake. This is the story of Whitey Bulger. James Joseph Bulger, Jr. was born in 1929, a child of the Great Depression, raised in the red brick labyrinth of the Mary Ellen McCormick Housing Project in South Boston, the first public housing project in New England. It was known then and now simply as Southie. From an early age, he was a study in contrasts. He was fiercely loyal to his family, particularly his younger brother, William, who would rise through the legitimate corridors of power to become the president of the Massachusetts State Senate, one of the most powerful political figures in the state. James, however, chose a different path. He was a notorious brawler and thief, known for his hair-trigger temper and a charisma that could be both charming and deeply menacing. His shock of platinum blonde hair earned him the nickname Whitey, a moniker he loathed, preferring to be called Jim or Jimmy. To him, Whitey was a headline, a caricature. Jimmy was the man his neighbors knew, the one who might carry their groceries or slip a $20 bill to a family in need, all while plotting to put a bullet in the back of a rival's head. His formal criminal education began early, with arrests for larceny and assault dotting his youth. He joined a street gang called the Shamrocks and quickly graduated to more serious crimes. After a stint in the Air Force, which ended with an honorable discharge he likely didn't deserve, he returned to Boston and escalated his activities, committing a series of armed robberies. In 1956, his luck ran out. He was arrested for hijacking a truck and, a few months later, for robbing a series of banks across 3 states. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. It was this sentence that would introduce him to the darkest corners of the American penal system, including a transfer to the infamous island fortress of Alcatraz. It was during his time in the federal system, specifically at the Atlanta Penitentiary before Alcatraz, that Bulger claimed to have been an unwilling participant in the CIA's MKUltra program. The program was a series of clandestine and illegal human experiments designed to test mind control techniques, often using psychoactive drugs like LSD. Bulger alleged he was told he was part of a project to find a cure for schizophrenia and was injected with the drug more than 50 times. He described terrifying hallucinations, paranoia, and a profound sense of psychological violation. While the full truth of his specific involvement remains debated, the program was very real, and the experience, as he relayed it, seemed to have cemented a deep-seated paranoia and a cold, clinical detachment that would define his later actions. When he was finally released from prison in 1965, the man who returned to the streets of South Boston was harder, colder, and infinitely more disciplined than the hot-headed hoodlum who had left. He returned to a Boston underworld in flux. The dominant force in the city's Irish mob was the Killeen Gang, led by Donald Killeen. A rival faction, the Mullen Gang, led by Polly McGonigal, was challenging their supremacy. A bloody gang war erupted, and Bulger, initially working as an enforcer for the Killeens, saw an opportunity. He was a methodical, patient predator. While others were being gunned down in brazen public hits, Bulger operated from the shadows. He was a ghost, his name whispered in connection with violence, but rarely proven. The war culminated in 1972 when Donald Killeen was shot and killed. Bulger is widely believed to have been the triggerman. With Killeen gone, Bulger brokered a peace and consolidated the remnants of both gangs into a new, more formidable organization, the Winter Hill Gang, nominally led by the veteran gangster Howie Winter. But everyone on the street knew who held the real power. Howie was the boss in name. Jimmy was the boss in practice. The Winter Hill Gang was brutally efficient. They controlled loan sharking, illegal gambling, truck hijackings, and armored car robberies. And at the center of it all was Bulger, a phantom who enforced his will with shocking violence. He wasn't a brawler anymore. He was a killer. He and his chief lieutenant, a stone-cold psychopath named Stephen Flemmi, known as the Rifleman, became the architects of a reign of terror. Their methods were personal and sadistic. They didn't just kill their enemies. They enjoyed the process. They would lure victims to houses they controlled, interrogate and torture them for information, and then murder them in cold blood, often burying the bodies in the basements or in shallow graves in remote locations. This was the man operating with impunity in Boston. And the reason for that impunity was about to be formalized in a deal that would stain the reputation of the FBI for a generation. The architect of this unholy alliance was a man named John Connolly. Like the Bulger brothers, Connolly had grown up in the Southie projects. He remembered James Bulger as a neighborhood legend, a tough guy who once saved him from a street fight. To Connolly, Bulger wasn't just a gangster. He was a product of the same world, a man who understood its codes and its loyalties. After a career in law school and a stint at the FBI, Connolly was transferred back to the Boston field office in the mid-1970s. His primary mission, and the FBI's top priority at the time was the complete dismantling of La Cosa Nostra, the Italian-American mafia, specifically the Patriarca crime family that ruled New England. Connolly believed the best way to destroy the mafia was to use their enemies against them, and in Boston, the mafia's biggest enemy was the Irish mob. Connolly approached William Bulger, the powerful state senator, to help facilitate a meeting with his brother. The pitch was simple: help us and we'll help you. The target was the Patriarca family. Whitey Bulger, a virulent anti-Italian racist and a savvy criminal strategist, saw the genius in the proposal immediately. He wasn't interested in patriotism or civic duty. He saw a business opportunity. By becoming a protected informant for the FBI, he could use the full power and intelligence of the federal government as his own personal enforcement wing. He could systematically eliminate his rivals, solidify his power, and build his criminal empire, all while his handler, John Connolly, wrote glowing reports about his value as an informant. In 1975, James Whitey Bulger was officially designated as Informant BS 1544TE. TE stood for Top Echelon. Stephen Flemmi was also recruited. The deal with the devil was done. The first major test of this corrupt bargain came in 1979. An indictment came down charging nearly the entire leadership of the Winter Hill Gang, including Howie Winter and Whitey Bulger, in a massive horse race-fixing scheme. It was a solid, career-making case for the prosecutors. But just before the indictment was unsealed, John Connolly went to his superiors. He argued that Bulger and Flemmi were too valuable as informants in the war against the mafia to be taken off the street. He convinced his supervisor, John Morris, to quietly remove their names from the indictment. And so, while Howie Winter and the rest of the gang's leadership went to prison, Bulger and Flemmi walked free. With Winter gone, Bulger now had sole, undisputed control of the Winter Hill Gang. The FBI hadn't just protected him, they had promoted him. He was now the king of the Boston underworld, and he owed it all to his federal benefactors. From that point on, the arrangement became a grotesque feedback loop of corruption. Bulger and Flemmi would feed Connolly information, often intelligence they gathered through their own criminal networks, about the operations of the Patriarca family. Connolly, in turn, used this information to build cases, make arrests, and plant bugs. His star within the FBI soared. He was lauded as a brilliant investigator, the man who finally broke the back of the New England Mafia. He received commendations and cash bonuses. His supervisors, like John Morris, who were also benefiting from the positive statistics, were happy to look the other way, accepting Connolly's assurances that his informants were invaluable and not involved in any serious violence. It was a lie of monumental proportions. In return for the anti-mafia intelligence, Connolly provided Bulger with an invaluable service: counterintelligence. He became Bulger's mole inside law enforcement. He would warn Bulger about wiretaps, surveillance operations, and, most critically, other informants. If someone in Bulger's orbit was suspected of cooperating with the police, Connolly would pass the name to Bulger. It was a death sentence. One of the most infamous examples was the Lancaster Street Garage. The garage was a front for the Angulo crime family, the Boston faction of the Patriarchas. The FBI managed to plant a listening device there in 1981, a bug that would yield a treasure trove of evidence and lead to the decimation of the family's leadership. It was a huge victory for the FBI, and Connolly took much of the credit. But what wasn't known for years was that Connolly had tipped Bulger off that the garage was hot, and that anyone who went there would be recorded, ensuring that Bulger and his crew stayed far away, preserving their own operations while their primary rivals walked into the protection afforded by Connolly and the FBI wasn't just passive. It was an active shield that allowed Bulger's violence to escalate without consequence. Other law enforcement agencies, like the Massachusetts State Police and the Drug Enforcement Administration, would open investigations into Bulger's activities, only to find their efforts stonewalled by the FBI. Cases would suddenly go cold. Witnesses would refuse to cooperate. Files would get lost. Bulger seemed untouchable, a ghost who moved through the city's underworld, leaving a trail of bodies, yet never facing any real scrutiny from the one agency that should have been his greatest threat. He had transformed the FBI from his hunter into his bodyguard. With this federal shield, Bulger's reign of terror entered its darkest phase. He and Flemmi, along with other members of their crew like Kevin Weeks, operated with a sense of complete invincibility. They controlled the flow of cocaine and marijuana into South Boston, all while Bulger cultivated a public image as a man who kept drugs out of the neighborhood. This was one of his most cynical and effective manipulations. He would violently punish street-level dealers who weren't paying him tribute, a spectacle that made him look like a community protector to some, while he was, in fact, the city's biggest drug lord. The money poured in, millions of dollars from drugs, extortion of legitimate and illegitimate businesses, and loan sharking. But the true currency of his empire was fear, and it was minted in blood. The list of Bulger's victims is long and horrifying, and their stories reveal the true cost of the FBI's corrupt bargain. Take the case of Brian Halloran. In 1982, Halloran, a former associate of the Winter Hill Gang, was facing a murder charge and decided to become an informant. He went to the FBI and offered to testify that Bulger and Flemmi were responsible for the murder of a missing businessman named Roger Wheeler in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was information that could have taken Bulger down. The information was passed to John Connolly. Connolly's duty was clear: protect the informant. Instead, he protected his asset. He immediately called Bulger and told him that Halloran was talking. A few weeks later, on a waterfront street in Boston, as Halloran sat in a car with a man named Michael Donahue, an innocent construction worker and father of 3 who had simply offered him a ride home, a vehicle pulled alongside. A hail of gunfire erupted. Halloran was killed instantly. Michael Donahue, a man in the wrong place at the very worst time, was also murdered. 2 men were dead because an FBI agent chose to protect a killer instead of an informant. The depravity knew no bounds. The corruption wasn't just about protecting Bulger's business interests. It extended to protecting him and his associates from the consequences of their most personal and monstrous acts. Stephen Flemmi had a longtime girlfriend named Deborah Davis. In 1981, Davis learned of Flemmi's relationship with the FBI and decided to leave him. Flemmi, fearing she would expose them, confided in Bulger. Their solution was simple. Flemmi lured Davis to a house he owned. Bulger was waiting. He strangled her to death with his bare hands. They then wrapped her body in a tarpaulin and buried her by a riverbank. Years later, they would have to move the body when they feared the grave might be discovered. She was just one of the women in their orbit to meet a brutal end. Flemmi's own stepdaughter, Deborah Hussey, was also murdered by Bulger after Flemmi complained she had become a drug addict and a problem. He strangled her in his own mother's house. These were not mob hits or acts of gangland warfare. These were the savage, intimate murders of women, carried out by 2 men who knew with absolute certainty that they would never be held accountable. Their FBI handlers, John Connolly and John Morris, received expensive gifts, cases of wine, and envelopes of cash from their star informants, all while these atrocities were taking place. For over a decade the system worked perfectly for Bulger. But the seeds of its destruction were being sown by investigators outside the FBI's corrupt sphere of influence. A new generation of federal prosecutors and investigators from the DEA and the Massachusetts State Police began to circle Bulger's operations in the early 1990s. They were not from Southie. They had no personal loyalties to John Connolly or the old guard at the Boston FBI. They saw Bulger not as an asset, but as the head of a massive criminal enterprise that was flooding the city with drugs and responsible for a string of unsolved murders. They began to build their case slowly, meticulously, using a powerful legal tool, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. A RICO indictment allowed them to prosecute Bulger not just for a single crime, but for being the leader of an ongoing criminal enterprise, connecting him to decades of extortion, drug trafficking, and murder. The new investigative team worked in secret, wary of leaks from within the FBI. By late 1994, they had their case. A sealed RICO indictment was prepared, naming James Whitey Bulger, Stephen Flemmi, and other key associates. It was the beginning of the end. John Connolly had retired from the FBI by this time, but his loyalties remained. He maintained his contacts within the Bureau, and one of them, his old supervisor, John Morris, tipped him off that the hammer was about to fall. On a cold night, just before Christmas on December 23, 1994, Connolly met with his childhood hero and criminal partner, Whitey Bulger. He gave him the warning. The indictment was coming down in a matter of days. You need to go. Bulger packed a bag, picked up his longtime girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, and fled. Stanley, however, quickly tired of life on the run and wanted to return to her children. Bulger dropped her off and, in a testament to his cold-hearted pragmatism, summoned his other girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, to join him. Together, they vanished without a trace. When the federal agents finally moved in to make their arrests in early January 1995, Stephen Flemmi was apprehended, but Whitey Bulger was gone. The man who had ruled Boston for 20 years was now a fugitive. The initial belief was that he would be caught within weeks, but weeks turned into months, and months into years. Whitey Bulger, the man who knew all the secrets, had become a ghost once again. His disappearance, however, was the very thing that finally broke the wall of corruption. Stephen Flemmi, facing a life sentence and the possibility of the death penalty in Oklahoma and Florida for murders committed there, decided to do the one thing he and Bulger had always despised in others. He became an informant. But Flemmi wasn't informing on the mafia. He began to tell the whole sordid story of his and Bulger's two-decade relationship with the FBI. He laid it all bare. The protection, the leaks, the murders that were ignored, the warnings from John Connolly. He confessed to his own heinous crimes and detailed Bulger's. Most importantly, he exposed the rot at the core of the Boston FBI. Flemmi's testimony was a bombshell that triggered a series of investigations, not into the mob, but into the FBI itself. The Justice Department was forced to confront the horrifying reality that its own agents had been complicit in the crimes of one of the nation's most violent gangsters. The fallout was catastrophic. John Connolly, the celebrated agent, was indicted. His trial was a spectacle, revealing the depth of his betrayal. He was convicted of racketeering and obstruction of justice in 2002 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. But that wasn't the end. He was later extradited to Florida to face charges for his role in the murder of John Callahan, a casino executive killed by a Winter Hill hitman on Bulger's orders after Connolly warned that Callahan was about to cooperate with investigators. In 2008, Connolly was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to an additional 40 years. The hero G-Man was exposed as a common criminal, a murderer's accomplice. His supervisor, John Morris, was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, admitting he had taken bribes and leaked information. The FBI was publicly shamed, its informant protocols completely overhauled, its reputation in Boston left in tatters. While the legal system was cleaning its own house, the human cost of Bulger's reign continued to be unearthed. Literally, acting on information from Kevin Weeks, Bulger's former lieutenant, who also began cooperating, investigators started digging. They went to a nondescript house across the street from a gas station. In the basement, buried in a dirt floor cellar, they found the remains of 3 of Bulger's victims. They went to a patch of land along the Neponset River and found the grave of Deborah Davis. The discovery of these clandestine grave sites brought a new level of horror to the city. The victims' families, who had spent decades not knowing what happened to their loved ones, were finally given an answer, but it was an answer wrapped in the unbearable truth that the killers had been protected by the federal government. All the while, Whitey Bulger remained at large. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, with a $2 million reward for his capture. It was the ultimate irony. The FBI was now hunting its own creation. For 16 years, he and Catherine Gregg lived a quiet life under assumed names, first traveling the country and even abroad, before settling in a modest apartment in Santa Monica, California. They were Charlie and Carol Gasco, a retired couple who paid their rent in cash and kept to themselves. He was a phantom hiding in plain sight. The manhunt seemed destined to become a permanent cold case. But in 2011, the FBI, frustrated by the lack of leads on Bulger himself, shifted its strategy. They launched a new media campaign focused not on the feared gangster, but on his companion, Catherine Gregg. They ran television ads in places she was known to have frequented, focusing on her habits, her love of animals, her penchant for visiting beauty salons. The theory was that someone would recognize the woman, not the monster she was with. The strategy worked. A tip came in from Anna Bjornsdottir, a former actress and Miss Iceland, who lived in their Santa Monica neighborhood. She recognized the photos of the couple she knew as the Gascos. She had even fed their cat. On June 22, 2011, a team of FBI agents set up surveillance on the apartment complex. They lured Bulger out to the garage with a ruse about his storage locker. When the frail 81-year-old man appeared, they surrounded him. The reign of Whitey Bulger was over. Inside their apartment, agents found over $822,000 in cash hidden in the walls, along with a stunning arsenal of more than 30 firearms. The ghost had finally been caught. The trial of James Whitey Bulger in the summer of 2013 was a final grim circus. The federal courthouse in Boston was packed every day with the families of his victims, who came to stare down the man who had haunted their lives for so long. Bulger, with his thinning white hair and neatly trimmed goatee, looked more like a malevolent professor than a gangster. He was defiant, often profane, and utterly unrepentant. His defense was not to claim innocence of the violence. Instead, his lawyers argued a bizarre and unsubstantiated theory that he was never an FBI informant. He claimed he had a deal with a lone federal prosecutor, now deceased, who had given him immunity to commit any crime he wanted, short of murder, in exchange for protecting the prosecutor's life from the mafia. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite his own history, to salvage his reputation on the street. To a man like Bulger, being called a murderer was a badge of honor. Being called a rat was the ultimate sin. The jury didn't buy it. They listened for 2 months as former associates, hardened killers themselves, took the stand and detailed his crimes in chilling detail. They heard from the families of the victims, who gave heart-wrenching testimony about their loss. In August 2013, the jury found Bulger guilty on 31 of 32 counts, including racketeering, extortion, and most importantly, they found him responsible for his involvement in 11 murders. He was formally sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. The judge, addressing him directly, said, "The scope, the callousness, the depravity of your crimes are almost unfathomable." Bulger was sent away to serve his sentence in the federal prison system, destined to die behind bars. His violent end, however, would come sooner than anyone expected. On October 30, 2018, just hours after being transferred to a new high-security penitentiary in West Virginia, USP Hazleton, the 89-year-old Bulger was beaten to death in his cell by other inmates. The man who had lived by brutality died by it. The story of Whitey Bulger is now closed, but its lessons are etched into the history of American justice. When we dissect the anatomy of this case, we find the corruption was not merely the product of one rogue agent. It was systemic. It was born from an institutional obsession, a belief within the FBI that the war against the mafia justified any means necessary. It revealed how personal relationships and misguided loyalties, like John Connolly's twisted hero worship of a hometown gangster, could completely subvert the mission of a federal agency. It demonstrated a catastrophic failure of oversight, a willingness of supervisors to embrace plausible deniability, to celebrate the statistics, a valuable asset produced, without scrutinizing the bloody cost. The legacy of this unholy alliance is a deep and lasting wound. It is the story of the Donahue family, the Davis family, the Hussey family, and so many others, who learned that their government was not only incapable of protecting their loved ones, but was actively protecting their killers. It fundamentally eroded public trust in law enforcement, a trust that, once broken, is painstakingly difficult to rebuild. The case forced the FBI to reckon with its own demons and to drastically reform its informant handling procedures, creating firewalls and oversight committees designed to prevent such a devastating concentration of power in one agent's hands ever again. But the central, chilling truth of Whitey Bulger's story remains. He was a monster, but he did not operate in a vacuum. He was a predator who was fed, sheltered, and protected by the very institution created to hunt his kind. His power was not self-made, it was granted. The anatomy of this case reveals that the most terrifying corruption is not the evil that works against the system, but the evil that the system cultivates within itself. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.